Studying Brazil's history is nearly impossible without examining how the Bandeirantes expanded its territory. Few realize how São Paulo's complex political system enabled these men's actions. And what few people also know is that it was a diplomat born in Santos who was responsible for negotiating with Spain the definitive expansion of Brazil's borders. But why, out of all the captaincies, was it only São Vicente that stood out in the expansion into the interior? Why didn't the same happen with other captaincies further north? Why did the Paulistas rebel so much against the Portuguese crown? And why did Portugal give up the possibility of colonizing the Philippines in favor of Brazil's territorial expansion? In today's video, we'll examine the vital role Paulistas played in Brazil's territorial expansion. The São Paulo region has stood out in Brazil since Portuguese settlement began. São Vicente, granted to Martim Afonso de Souza, was among the most prosperous captaincies, thanks to the Tupiniquim tribe's collaboration led by Chief Tibiriçá. And this collaboration was made possible by the mediation of a Portuguese castaway named João Ramalho, who had established contact with the indigenous people of that tribe, and it allowed the Donatário to establish lasting settlements in the region. But the captaincy of São Vicente was the target of many attacks from the very beginning. In 1534, the War of Iguape was fought against the Spanish, and in 1541, the settlement suffered from a tsunami. And shortly after, they would already have to help the Portuguese in Guanabara Bay, sending troops of Portuguese and Tupiniquim Indians to fight the French and Tamoio Indians who were trying to settle in Antarctic France. However, despite all the challenges, the settlements and villages promoted by the Jesuit priests helped the captaincy prosper a lot. And one of these villages, in fact, was built around the Jesuit College of São Paulo, and it would create the largest city in the southern hemisphere. In São Vicente, while growing in the midst of constant warfare, being a territory close to the border of all the islands, also had a very important geographical factor that made it easier to move inland. In the Serra do Mar, very close to the coast, a river called Tietê is born, which instead of flowing toward the sea as most rivers usually do, flowed inland. And so, since the beginning of the captaincy of São Vicente, the people from São Paulo used the course of the Tietê River to head inland in search of riches. Isolated by the Serra do Mar and the plateau, they developed a high degree of autonomy, with their city council making several decisions for their self-preservation, completely independent from the Portuguese crown. This was something very common in the region, as Jorge Caldera points out in his book, Neither Heaven Nor Hell. São Vicente went through a long period of isolation, being governed by the good men, the councilmen, who were elected from among the people and took turns in power. Both the councilmen and the judges were elected, and in this way, all three branches of power were exercised by the citizens. In fact, for half a century, no external official from the Portuguese crown was seen. There, under their own regulations, São Vicente's society was organized. Caldera mentions in his book that João Ramalho, for example, walked around naked with his 30 indigenous wives, and even so, was a regular councilman in São Vicente. When the Jesuits founded São Paulo, he became their protector, despite his practices already showing some disagreements with the order, and among these disagreements was slavery. Both the Portuguese and the Tupiniquim Indians widely practiced slavery. Slavery was not only practiced by the Portuguese, but was also a long-standing indigenous custom, not unique to the Tupiniquim. Their enemies, the Tamoios, also practiced it. And over time, many Bandeirantes began to attack Jesuit missions in the interior to try to subjugate the indigenous people. And the legends involving riches in the interior, associated with the geography that favored expansion inland, and the laws and great autonomy of the captaincy, created the perfect environment for expeditions to be formed that would head into the interior in search of wealth. Added to this is the Mameluco, or Caboclo, the child of indigenous people and whites who became the chief Bandeirantes. combining knowledge of the forests, the indigenous people and their language, and the handling of firearms and Portuguese customs. Precisely because the Bandeirantes were, for the most part, of mixed race, João Ramalho is considered the father of the Bandeirantes from São Paulo, since many of his descendants would join the expeditions. And one of the interesting points to observe about the Bandeiras is the complexity of the relationships in the captaincy of São Vicente. It is extremely difficult to fit the Bandeiras into any generic category. You can't say it's a conflict of white slaveholders against Indians, since most of the Bandeirantes were of mixed race, caboclos, and also Indians. You can't say it was a conflict of Catholics against pagan Indians, since many Bandeirantes attacked the missions of Jesuit priests, and some, like Raposo Tavares, were even new Christians, with relatives persecuted by the Inquisition. His anti-Catholic hatred led him to destroy Jesuit settlements and burn their churches. But you also can't say, because of that they are anti-clerical against the Jesuits. Many Bandeirantes, despite defying the Pope's orders and being excommunicated for enslaving indigenous people, still devoted themselves to Our Lady of O. Sometimes they were welcomed by Jesuit rival orders. Sometimes even priests accompanied the expeditions, like Father Fiallo, who took part in the discovery of the gold mines in Ouro Preto. So the Bandeirantes from São Paulo have many particularities, and the expeditions had multiple purposes. There were punitive expeditions, like Domingos Jorge Velhos, that destroyed the Quilombo dos Palmares, along with others to capture indigenous people or find precious stones in gold mines inland. Myths and legends like El Dorado also captured the imagination of São Paulo's people. They believed they would find gold mines, precious stones, and unimaginable riches in the middle of the backlands that would make everyone rich. That's why the Bandeiras were organized into grand expeditions aiming to secure these riches hidden somewhere in the interior of Brazil. And the Bandeirantes needed to use their creativity to overcome the most adverse situations. One example is that of Bartolomeu Bueno da Silva. When he saw the Goiás Indians with gold, he set fire to a bowl of burning water with sulfur. The Indians, shocked by the burning water, didn't know how it was possible. The Bandeirante claimed he was a sorcerer and threatened to set the rivers on fire unless they revealed the gold's source. And that's exactly why he got the nickname Anhanguera, or the Old Devil. Some, like Fernão Dias, the Emerald Hunter, died in the middle of the backlands thinking he had found the stones, which were actually just tourmalines, and others, like Raposo Tavares. Getting lost, he ended up traveling all over Brazil until he returned home unrecognizable after so much wandering. But it wasn't just against the settled indigenous people that the Bandeirantes fought. The conflicts often also happen with the Portuguese crown itself. Since São Paulo always had a lot of autonomy in its legislative chamber, some rules from the kingdom simply didn't apply to São Paulo. We have as an example indigenous slavery, which was prohibited by the law of the Kingdom of Portugal and even by papal bulls. However, Bandeirantes and indigenous allies continued the practice, saying it was an established chamber custom. And when the Jesuits in 1640 tried to abolish this practice, they ended up being expelled by the population in an episode known as the Botada dos Padres. They only returned to São Paulo 13 years later in 1653. Other Bandeirantes had problems with the law, like Anhanguera, who was accused by the crown of hiding riches to evade taxes. And also Borba Gato, who was on the run until he found riches and negotiated the extinction of his sentence. The Bandeirantes also took part in conflicts against the Portuguese from the Iberian Peninsula, such as the War of the Zamboabas, precisely because many outsiders came to try to exploit the mines discovered by the Bandeirantes. But was it during the Iberian Union that the expeditions into the interior of Brazil intensified the most? With Portugal and Castile ruled by one monarch, former enmity between Castilians and Portuguese became an alliance, and the Tordesillas borders became less guarded. So the Bandeirantes undertook large expeditions, crossing the Tordesillas line and establishing settlements on the Spanish side of the border. The lands of Brazil were not densely populated. In fact, to find a tribe, the Bandeirantes had to travel long distances through vast deserted regions without any sign of human life. These deserts, without people but full of animals, dangers, and forests, became known as desertões. That's how the word sertão came from deserto. That's why the Bandeirantes were also called sertanistas, those who went to the sertão, to the desert, to the middle of nowhere where there were no people. And with the end of the Iberian Union, the Bandeirantes intensified their expeditions even more, founding even more settlements and attacking even more Jesuit missions already near the Rio de la Plata basin. But these territorial conquests by the Bandeirantes caused problems between Portugal and Castile. And these conflicts would only be resolved through the intervention of a diplomat from São Paulo, a Portuguese man named Alexandre de Gusmão. Born in Santos on the coast of São Paulo, he was the brother of Bartolomeo de Gusmão, a prodigious priest who invented the concept of the hot air balloon. Alexandre became renowned as an important diplomat, having studied in Coimbra and worked in Paris and Rome, serving the Portuguese crown. As a skilled negotiator, he was one of those responsible for mediating relations between Castile and Portugal, aiming to redefine the borders of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Through advanced cartographic studies, the Portuguese managed to prove that if Portugal crossed Tordesillas through the expeditions, as well, Castile had crossed the line of the Treaty of Zamora, taking possession of the Philippines, which in theory should have belonged to Portugal. And so, in the negotiations between the court of Dom Juan V and Fernando VI, Alexandre consolidated the Roman principle of uti possidetis. That is, possession would belong to whoever was already in the territory. Possession would come from use. And so the Philippines would go to Spain, even though they were in Portuguese domains. And a large part of Brazil would go to Portugal, thanks to the actions of the Bandeirantes and Pedro Teixeira in the Amazon. Gusmão was also responsible for establishing the borders between the territories using natural barriers, such as rivers, mountains, and valleys, rather than imaginary lines. And that's exactly why Brazil's borders are not straight lines, as they are in other parts of the world. As Jaime Cortesão points out in his work about Alexandre de Gusmão, it was Gusmão, as royal secretary, who took the lead, especially when the king was very ill, writing the directives and also giving instructions. The letters of the treaty and its directives were only signed by the Secretary of State and immediately sent to the Portuguese negotiator in Madrid. A Portuguese man born in São Paulo, Brazil, secured Brazil's borders in the Treaty of Madrid, ensuring the Portuguese crown kept the Bandeirantes conquests. However, after Dom João Vitor's death, Alexandre's time at the Portuguese court ended unhappily. Gusmão was not a well-liked figure by the Marquis of Pombal, who despised him and made a point of increasingly sidelining him in politics. And that's how the Paulistas managed to expand the territory of Brazil. For a long time, the Bandeirantes were regarded by Paulista culture as a race of giants and a source of pride. And today they are reinterpreted by historiography as bad men, even having their statues burned. The fact is that, regardless of the positive or negative view, they were the ones who not only expanded the borders, but also found gold in Minas Gerais, bringing a lot of wealth to Portugal. And they even created the caipira culture, using the viola as a way to entertain themselves during their journeys, and even as a means of communication among themselves. The people from São Paulo, through hardship and mud, crossed Brazil and redefined its borders. They are men who don't fit into simple categories like villains or heroes, but who were decisive in history. São Paulo, from its very beginning and even today, is a land of contradictions and rebellion, but also of ambition, cleverness, and many achievements. Did you know São Paulo influenced Brazil's expansion? What surprised you most? So go ahead and leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of our channel right now. That way you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the impressive Iberian history.